Good morning. Um, just as a quick brief on the starting the program, this is part two. If you attended the part one program, that was more or less involved with learning how to start your tomato seeds. And at this point, we hope that everything is up and growing and you're about ready to put them in the ground. So we actually bring in part two, and that's how we put the program together. And then part three, which is upcoming, will also be something that we discuss as far as handling the various diseases and stuff. So getting back to this program, these programs were originally created by Sam Scarcella. We call this a legacy program. And then Sam asked me to continue it. Unfortunately, he passed away some time ago. And anyway, so we continue to take the information our master gardeners have learned, and then we continue to bring them forward with new information. And with that, let's get going with this. So as I said, the first prank was about starting tomatoes from seed. This particular program deals with growing tomatoes in Galveston County. In other words, you're getting ready to put them in the ground. So we time it about this time to help you guys out. And then the third program will be later on in March. And Ginger can give you some idea what dates or that would be. But that has to do with the diseases and tomato stress management. So in other words, you've got them, everything is going, but then all of a sudden the problems start occurring. In doing this, what we're going to cover in part two, we're going to cover about choosing a good location. We're going to discuss getting organized. We're going to discuss choosing a variety in case you haven't grown it from seeds. You know what, you can go out and maybe and find some of the varieties that are out there that work well in this area. The most important thing is understanding the timing of when to plant based on your location in this area, preparing the soil, and how to go about planting your transplants, including, a thing that we do here is planting horizontally. Also, for those that garden in containers, we're going to have a discussion on that, what we feel is the best way to grow that, tomatoes in containers. Supporting and protecting your transplants in the garden will be discussed, and understanding the right time to pick your tomatoes. And what do you do with green tomatoes? Sometimes when we plant in the fall, frost comes up or something happens, and then we're going to discuss that. And then also we're going to touch on protecting transplants against birds, weather, and diseases. So getting back to what let's get started on this thing. So planning ahead of where to plant. The first thing you want to do is pick a site that gives your tomato plant at least 8 hours of sunlight a day. If you don't have that, you're going to struggle. And we generally have found that a minimum of 6 hours of sunlight is required. If you got less than that, it's going to be very difficult to grow good tomatoes without that. 6 hours, you might even have to add another plant to be able to get the production that you're looking for. And plan on using a raised bed here in Galveston County. The gumbo soil, the rain is just easier to water. And we'll get into the soils later on, and we can show you why we kind of recommend that method. Also figure out how much space you have available for planting tomatoes. And this is going to help you determine how many plants you can grow. And then you're going to have to plan to either stake, you can trellis or cage your tomatoes, but all of them work well. I mean, it's been a history of using these type of things to mechanically, support your tomatoes. You're going to need water access, plan to water on a regular basis. And what I'm saying there is, if you've got a nice area back on the back 40, if you have such a property, you got to realize that tomatoes basically take a lot of water. So if you feel like pumping a whole bunch of water to these things every other day, it's going to be a pretty much of a struggle for you. So plan to see where you've got the nearest water access so that you can water your tomatoes properly. A good location should have good drainage, and again, plenty of full sunlight, 8 hours. And this is going to have a direct effect on yield. You want to plant them in good and rich soil. You hopefully not too much wind, and on the island and on or near the bay, this is always an issue. And you may have to protect the transplants when they are first planted in the ground because the wind can just tear them up. And let's talk about getting organized. One of the things that, we're trying to help you out here is that you're not making 50 trips back and forth from where you're trying to prepare your area. So gather all the necessary materials and tools at one time. And, that is going to be your fertilizer, your starter solution, your buckets, stakes, containers, cages, any special fertilizer. We're going to talk about cutworm collars, possibly watering rings, pump sprayers, stuff like that. Try to get that all organized and bring it to the site at one time. And one of the things I want to include here is that, Sam always taught me this, and that one of the best tools is a good sprayer. Because, that's what you're going to need for keeping these things growing properly through the season. Okay, let's talk about spacing. If you're using cages between plants, you're going to need a minimum of 30 inches for determinants. And for indeterminate plants, 36 inches. So in other words, that's the spacing between the plants. And the cage height should be at least 60 to 72 inches. And if you're going to use stakes between plants, you will need a minimum of 24 inches. So you can get a little closer for determinants and indeterminants. You can do 30 inches. And we suggest that the stakes that you use, if you're going to use stakes, should be a 2x2 by 96. And try to put them at least 2 feet in the ground if you can get them that way. Row spacing should be about 4 feet apart. You can stagger your plants to get a little closer, but plants too close are going to introduce diseases. And that's the whole point of giving you all this information. If you get them too close, it reduces the airflow. And we're all guilty of this, trying to put as many plants as you can into your little garden, and then end up actually, you forget how they grow, and then it end up blocks all of the wind and even sometimes the sun from other plants. Also, if you're getting less than 8 hours of sunlight, you're probably going to need more spacing to allow more sun to your plants. Okay, this is one of the things now we're getting ready to, let's talk about choosing a variety. If you look at one of the handouts that we sent to you, you'll see that we have for Galveston County, and it's the surrounding area as well, we have a list that we've pretty well worked through for us in this area. And you'll see a lot of them are highlighted, and we'll also give you the various resistance to diseases and the sizes and the actual days to maturity thing. So if you look through this, we have early season, mid-season, we have beefsteak, we have heirlooms, and then we have the Italian paste tomatoes, which, by the way, we're getting ready to start a full test on what we'll do better here in this area for paste tomatoes. We have small fruit, and then we have a number of others. So use that as a guide. We've been very successful planting the varieties that we have here. If you can't find them, that's always the issue with some items we've got on the list that this year they're popular, and then 2 years from now they stop production or something. So we try to evaluate and update this as best we can, but this should give you some good guidance on what to look for whenever you start to buy your tomato starts. In that variety listing, you'll see determinate versus indeterminate. You'll see early season, mid-season, late season, heirloom, hybrid. In that list, the disease resistance, you'll see a bunch of letters and stuff. But one of the other things we always consider is taste, and then plan usage. So let's just talk about choosing a variety that are determinate plants. This refers to a bush variety that reaches a certain height and usually tends to stop growing. And the majority of the fruit is going to grow at the end of the branches, with all fruit production basically maturing in about a month or two. Many varieties are especially suited for growing in pots in smaller gardens. In other words, some of these will only get about 3 or 4 foot tall, some of them less, 2 foot. And actually this is very good for us for the plants, because one of the things that planting in pots, because one of the things that you run into is that if you get an indeterminate, which is more of a vining top, these things just keep going. It'll be 3 foot out through the cage and then 2 foot down the walkway and then next to the door and then sees your neighbor. And so, I mean, these type things, you need to understand that when, if you're going to grow in like in containers, Determinants is a good one. Also, they are very good for canning and freezing. Since the harvest is in a short period of time, you know, you're going to have a lot of tomatoes coming in at one time. So you're having that many tomatoes, then you can start putting it up and, you know, like I said, making paste, canning, whatever you're going to do with it. If you really want to stagger them out through the year, you can stagger the planting time if you want to stagger the production. The indeterminates, of course, is what we tend to grow more in this area, and most people grow. It's a variety that continues to grow and produce tomatoes throughout the growing season. It produces fruit all along the stem. It usually, as you know, because it's vine, you're going to need extra tall supports. We say of at least 5 foot. So some of the small cages that you find, say at Walmart or something, are usually not very good to be able to use for these type tomatoes. They can grow up to 10 to 15 feet tall, and so you need to be prepared for that. But these are great varieties for what we call slicers. They're salads and sandwiches and available throughout the growing season. Now let's talk about, they'll be classified, these tomatoes, as also by plant growth. They're classified as early, mid-season, and late season. So in other words, on an early season, a tomato that's going to mature somewhere between now 42 days to 67 days. A mid-season variety is a tomato that matures in 68 to 75 days. And the late season tomatoes, which includes a lot of heirlooms, are tomatoes that mature in 76 or 80, 90 days down the road. And this is critical for us to understand about growing tomatoes here in Galveston County. And it also is critical as to when we got to get these things in the ground. So, when should you start counting these days? And they give it all these days, but when do you start counting this thing? So when you plant it in the garden, when you start these seeds from indoors, it's all confusing. When you look it up online, it's all kinds of things that come up for this. But unfortunately, there's no standard definition. We've tried to get A&M to even kind of lock into that, but that hasn't happened. So just generally, I'll give you some as a guideline. Most sources work on the general agreement that if you start the seeds indoors and you transplant it into your garden, you start counting when you put the transplant in the ground. This also holds true for transplants you purchase as well. If you direct sow in the garden, start counting when the seeds germinate and you see the plant emerge, which is usually about a week or two. So it's pretty close. And some gardeners prefer to wait until the true leaves appear, which should be within another week. And these are only general guidelines that you can use to kind of help you with the days. I mean, there's no hard science to say, on that particular day, that's when this thing is going to be mature. So, I mean, it's also something that we have to look at. Anyway, the factors that is going to impact days to maturity, there's all kinds of factors will impact the actual number of days. Weather, of course, is going to be the biggest influence. Cold weather can cause seedlings to slow their growth or perhaps even stunt it. Too little or too much rain can also play havoc with the plants. Too much wind, not enough sun, soil conditions. So although they give you these days, we really have the ideal conditions. But given somewhat reasonable conditions, you can expect that the number of the seeds in the package that says, it matures in these number of days, it's a pretty good gauge to go by. So in these are some, I put in a quick list of some of what we feel are some of the terrific tomatoes we've grown here in this area. Celebrity is a, Old Faithful, Early Girl for Bush Early Girl. Parks Whopper is a really good one, my favorite. Fireworks has been a really interesting one. Champion 2, Better Boys, another old favorite. Big Beef for Paste, Aroma 2, and San Marzano also. So, these are some of those. I'm just giving you a few. You can actually look at the list that we've provided for you to kind of expand that if you want to. We also have, a recommendation for heirlooms and open pollinated tomatoes, Brandywine, German Johnson, Cherokee Purple, Black Crim, It's called Carbon, Siberia. Elfie is a yellow one. Tangerine is also yellow. New Big Dwarf is a very, it's an heirloom, but it's very small. It grows about 2 feet, but probably puts on a tomato that's about 1.5 pounds, sometimes pound. Black cherry is a very small cherry tomato, but very prolific. That's also an heirloom. Cherry tomatoes, we've found an excellent one that we've been recommending now called 4th of July. There's Sweet Chelsea, there's Juliet, there's Baxter's Early Bush, there's Yellow Pear, which is a yellow one, of course, Sweet Million, Cherry Blossom, and Texas Wild was discovered in East Texas. The things are about the size of your nail on your little finger, very productive, absolutely like tasting candy, but very prolific as well. So if you grow them, you're going to have a lot, and you're going to have a lot to handle. I can tell you that. Paste tomatoes, like I said, we felt we need to expand our variety listing that we feel it does well. Right now, we're recommending Andiamo, La Roma 2, and San Marzano. So if you're into growing paste tomatoes, that's some good ones here. For actual production, Champion was the highest producer ever at Texas A&M trials at 73 pounds a plant. The average production that we tend to get in most cases is of modern large hybrids is between 40 and 50 pounds a plant. Unfortunately for you guys, and hopefully we can get you to do better, the average homeowner produces less than 10 pounds a plant for the same variety. I also want to pass on to you that every year here in Galveston County at our Discovery Gardens, we actually do tomato test trials on. We try to set up 12 different varieties, and we do 2 plants of each. If you look at the 2020 varieties, you'll see that there's quite a lot of new stuff on there. I would like to bring your attention to the 4th of July. And look at that one, and you'll see that not big, but look at the number of tomatoes, and it produces a ton of tomatoes. Celebrity, like you saw on the list, look at that one. Parks Whopper, and you can have a look at some of the others. And we've given you a number of previous trials to compare and look at, but you can see the total production. You can also see the average height that we got, but in bringing your attention, you'll see also that the number, the days to maturity, we tend to not go over 75 days here. And that is because, we'll talk a little bit about that later, and that is because when the nighttime temperatures get to be around 75 degrees on a constant basis here, usually they will no longer pollinate. So if you're planting like an heirloom that's 90 days and you basically are planting this thing in March, good chances you may only get a handful of tomatoes off this thing. So you'll see that we try to plant at certain times, depending on the area you are in this county and the surrounding counties. You'll see also by the picture, we tend to have them grow what I call old style, and that is the fact that you'll see just a post, and we tie up with old sheets and stuff, and that is that if Joe Blow never has grown a tomato, we can show you that you don't have to get a whole bunch of cages and stuff. You can actually grow them with just what we call old style method, where we put a stake in the ground and you tie it up with sheets, and away you go, and fertilize. But we'll show you some other things on what we recommend doing with that as well. So this year's tomato test trial basically was the 4th of July. We did it again. Delicious, Genuine, Midnight Snack, Celebrity, Bella Rosa, Oregon Spring, which turned out not too bad, Debut, Stellar, Parks Whopper, Jet Setter, and Madame Maman, which is a very tomato that's used a lot in French cooking. So you can look at the 2020 test trials, and you can kind of get an idea of what the production was. Some of these, what we'll do is sometimes, definitely if one looks pretty good, we'll do it a second time just to make sure that it does produce well, and that was not a fluke. And sometimes we even do it a third time just to make sure that when we recommend something, that we're confident that it does well here. So In the test trials, you can kind of see the 4th of July. Uh, Peron, which one was, it's an Argentina-based, some South America, was the most naturally uh, disease resistant that's available. Camelo, Sunmaster was another one. That is, and this is one that was not recommended, and that was by Anna Russia. We find a lot of those from Russia, and although they're short day variety, will not do well here because of disease uh, issues that we run into with them. And then, and of course, for this year, we had these are the ones that are recommended. 4th of July, again by another group, Taste, early, very early production. Jet Setter was also good, and Madame Maman was good, and Oregon Spring 5 was also one of them that did very well here. Um, so let's talk about timing. Timing is going to be a very important thing. Timing, it's everything. You're going to plant your starts after the last average frost in your area. And the season is best extended at the beginning rather than trying to stretch into late June or July. So in Galveston County, and you know, and it does change a little bit when you go north of Harrison County, but here in Galveston County, by late June to early July, summer heat above 92 degrees, and when you have a repetitive high nighttime temperatures above 75 degrees, effectively ends the production of quality tomatoes. So kind of like you're looking at, when is this going to happen? So if I'm planting a 90-day tomato and I plant it in March, there you go, March, April, May, June. So by June, it's basically 90 days. So I'm just starting my production, but the temperatures are such that it no longer produces. So that's why you run into trouble. So if you're going to plant heirlooms, you have to actually already have them in the ground. Probably at the end of January, beginning of February, to be somewhat successful with these. Anyway, the other thing we're going to run into is that stink bugs and early blight can also bring the season to an early close. And if you're planting in the fall, now one of the issues you have to plant, timing wise, to beat the first frost in your area. So just giving you, based on NOAA, the average last spring frost in Galveston Island is January 31st. So this is where you're going to start looking at, when am I going to put my plants in the ground? So in Galveston Island, you basically should almost be ready. You should have either put them in or being ready to put them in. Texas City, Lamarck, February the 9th. Dickinson, Santa Fe, February the 12th. League City, Friendswood, Kemah, Clear Lake in the lower Houston area, February 27th, okay? So these are all things that, we need to kind of use as a guide to help us when to put them in the ground. Now, remember, this is Texas. So, we're looking at freezes next week. So how far they'll come down, it's going to be how you may have to protect them. But generally, these are what, data has shown us as being generally the last days you'll see the freeze. So any frost or any freeze will kill your plants. Now let's talk about, fall. If you're going to fall plant now, no one is looking at that now, but later on, basically you can, the last frost, in other words, you're going to have these planted way ahead of time if, because the frost will kill them. So you're looking at anywhere from, depending on the days that you have for maturity, like Galveston Island, December the 17th, if ever. Texas City, Lamarck, December 9th is probably the first frost. Dickinson, December 2nd. League City, November the 28th. And then Clear Lake and lower Houston area, November the 20th. So this gives you some ideas as to when to put them in the ground. And the idea is you got to get this, the sooner the better. So the other thing I want to kind of shift, a little bit the information on is soils. And I get a lot of questions about soil and, what terrible soil here, what we're going to do about it. Well, not a lot of things, but anyway, but just gives you a little history. But in 1899, soil survey was initiated in Texas, and in its first year, it basically mapped 720,000 acres. And what this did was basically affected property values, because when it did this, it said, you know, it was good to grow crops, certain crops on and some weren't. So if you had it identified as not being able to grow certain things, then your property didn't sell very well. But anyway, they continued. And now after 111 years, soil survey was completed November 10th, 2010. In the state of Texas, soil has been completely mapped with 171,891,840 acres. Information on soils that you can be found on the USDA website, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and selected soil. Another good source is Soil Web app. I've used that one a lot. And checking the mapped surveys can usually determine the limit of crops you can grow. And this is more, you know, if you've got a very large area and you want to put in a very large growing area, you can kind of see what if you go to these sites, you can see what type of soil you have and what you might have to do to possibly to amend it. But, you know, what they're finding more or less, and it's something we've kind of always known, the top 6 inches of the soil is the most significant. All soils are not created equal. If you're planting in a subdivision, which a lot of you guys do, you're dealing with man-made soil issues. In other words, they're bringing that stuff in. So in your area, before planting, it's recommended to do a soil test and to check your soil wattage drainage. Because there is some areas here, you know, because there's some low-lying areas, you need to possibly check it. And you can do this by digging a hole's 32 inches deep by 8 inches wide and fill with 5 to 7 gallons of water. You fill it with 5 to 7 gallons of water, and then you check the hours for the area to drain. So 1 to 8 hours is very good. 8 to 24 hours is good. 48 hours is marginal, and greater than 48 hours is unacceptable. That's why we tell you need to use a raised bed for sure. That's the only way it's going to work there. Everything is going to drown. Amending soils, non-organic, you can use sand. For sandy soils, you can drainage and aeration improvement, use coarse sand. You can use lime, but that raises the pH, and in a lot of these areas here in Galveston County, you don't want to do that. So we recommend generally not to use that, but if you in some area of the area, you still need to check it. You can use agricultural sulfur to lower the pH. And that's sometimes necessary if you're trying to grow a lot of blueberries. Expanded shale can be made available. That increases soil aeration and infiltration. Perlite improves porosity and water retention, and vermiculite improves aeration and water retention. Also, you can use, for organic means, you can use manures. It adds nutrients, not fresh. We recommend that most manures be at least 8 months old. Compost improves soil texture, water retention, and addition of nutrients. Mulch keeps soil moisture. Humus, it corrects soil balance, similar to compost. Peat moss, water retention. Wood products is soil improvement in time, but it may create a nitrogen deficiency. And let's talk about this again in more detail. But the garden with the most compost, when you're growing tomatoes, it's going to win. So if you've got a competition in your area, I guarantee if you got good compost, you know, your tomatoes will win. You need to be serious about adding organic matter to your soil here for growing tomatoes. You can make it, you can buy it, you can get the neighborhood clippings, but a soil rich in organic matter and nutrients is essential for growing tomato production, for good tomato production. The interest in organic gardening has highlighted the importance of compost for amending soils, whether clay or sandy in texture. Myself, I use a lot of mushroom compost and cottonseed hull compost in my tomato beds because it's easy to obtain. And mushroom compost quality is variable depending on how long it has been sitting. So fresh mushroom compost can be high in salts, but tomatoes are very salt tolerant and do well in mushroom compost. The soil preparation, you can do a soil analysis, can be helpful determining the type of soil. you have, as well as the pH and soil condition. A&M basically recommends you do this every 3 years by the extension here at the office. The results of the soil tests will reveal type, nutrient content, pH, as well as making recommendations for soil amendments. And the cost here is about $14 to do that. Prepare the beds before you plant your tomatoes. We want to prepare the beds about 2 weeks before planting. You're going to add any organic amendments such as compost, manure, cottonseed hull, and blood meal. You can incorporate 8 to 12 inches of compost worked into the bed. This sets a good nutrient foundation for a quick plant establishment, vigorous foliage development, and large fruit. Molasses is also a favorite soil additive for organic gardeners, and this serves as a food source for microorganisms. Cottonseed compost is basically has a 5-2-1 type of structure. Is one of the most readily available and cost-effective sources for organic fertility. It helps to acidify the soil and also contributes minor nutrients. And you want to use it at a rate of 4 pounds per square feet that are fertile and up to 10 pounds if low. And soil pH should be near neutral, somewhere between 6 and 7, and you need to lower it. You can add soil sulfur, we call it agricultural sulfur, or soil acidifier in just that first 6 inches of the soil so that you can you're shooting for a pH near neutral. In most cases, you'll also want to add an all-purpose conventional fertilizer like 15-5-10, which contains potassium and phosphorus. And with a lot of organic, if you've already put a lot of organic matter in soil, be a little judicious in how much you put in there so that you don't basically, we say, make it too hot to maybe damage your plants. And when planting transplant, avoid using fertilizers with high nitrogen content, because these can result in a tall, bushy plant that produce little fruit. To till or not to till? Well, the general feeling here is that the less tilling, the better. Most gardeners don't need to till. Even if you want one for the initial soil workup, you can always rent one. However, a small tiller can be used for shallow incorporation of compost and fertilizer. You want to work the soil only when the soil moisture conditions are right. And this is done by, you pick up a handful of soil and you squeeze it. And if it stays in a mud boil, it's too wet. If it crumbles freely, it's about right. And excessively dry soil is powdery and clumpy, and it may be difficult to work. And I want to emphasize that working excessively wet soils when you're trying to plant or when you're trying to till can destroy the soil structure, which can take up years to rebuild. Preparing your beds. Tomatoes are going to need rich, easy to work soil, well composted, as we discussed previously, with plenty of manure. We tend to feel that aged horse manure is better in rich soil to get the best results. So we want to basically say that, you know, it's much easier to get something like that. You can use cow manure, but generally it's a little hotter and you're going to have to let it sit a lot longer. And we always say that with any manure, as we said earlier, you know, 8 months to sit is the best thing to make sure that it starts to decompose properly. There's basically heavy clays here in Galveston, so that's the reason why we need to basically, you know, kind of amend the soils. If you're going to have raised beds, they need to be at least 12 inches in height, and it needs to be well drained, which, you know, automatically happens with the raised bed too. It does drain very well. And here in Galveston County at our garden, we tend to purchase for the soil a flour mix soil for our raised beds at the Discovery Garden here. Okay, now we're going to get into, okay, you've got your soil, you've kind of thought about it, you got it prepared, you're ready to go. Now I got to put my plants, my transplants. Okay, what am I going to do? I haven't grown anything from seeds, so now I got to go buy them. So that one of the things I want to bring to your attention is that the tomato plant that you look on your screen is on the far left is a store-bought one. I want you to notice a weak root system. This is because In a lot of these places, you know, and I'm going to say, I'm just going to identify it as big box stores. They're in a small container. More than likely it wasn't watered or fertilized correctly. And when you put this in the ground, it's going to make it a slow grower. And you remember we discussed there's a clock running on this thing. I mean, when it gets to be that nighttime temperature around 75 degrees, we're kind of done. So if we're too late, if it doesn't grow, we're going to lose production because of that. And so I want to just give you one on the right. This is what they should look like. It's one I've grown here. And then this one on the right is a homegrown one. And this type of root system will produce a good, healthy plant that will put on a lot of tomatoes. So, you know, just sometimes it's going to be hard when you're buying them, but you know, we'll give you some more indicators. So you want to avoid plants with blossoms or fruit already formed. I mean, you guys do this all the time. Oh man, I got tomatoes on this thing. It's full of, but I'm ready to go with this thing. Well, it's not. It's too far along, you know, for sometimes to put them in the ground. So advanced growth, and particularly if it's in a small container, could be a tip-off that the plants were over-fertilized as a seedling. And look for a plant that's tall as it is wide. You want to look for a plant that fits the pot. You know, you don't want a 4-inch pot that basically has a 3-foot plant stuck in it. You know, it's not what you're looking for. And look for transplants with healthy green leaves, no flower bunches. Avoid plants with yellow, thin, scraggly stems. And I want you to check for a sturdy central stem, which means the plant will likely be strong when it's transplanted to garden. I like to consider the sturdy stem to be something like the size of a pencil, if you can get it. Inspect the leaves for curling or discolorization, which could indicate a disease, poor lighting, underwatering, overwatering. Check foliage for holes and damaged stalks, and look underneath the leaves to make sure the plant is infested with pests, you know, like aphids or whitefly, anything like that. You don't want to bring that into your garden anyway. So prepping the plants. Okay, now, so we've got our plants, we've got them selected. Now we've got to prepare them and put them in the ground. This is some of the, you know, this is what Sam and I tend to do. We tend to, when we grow, we tend to grow them from and put them into 16-ounce, what I call styrofoam containers. And, you know, it can be 4-inch, you know, regular containers that you see, the little square containers. But we're going to use this one. But what we're going to do now is, okay, now you've picked your plants, you've bought them, now we're getting ready to put them in the ground. So what we're going to do is, you can see, we're going to remove those lower leaves. And you can see how we've cut them off there, okay? Then you're going to dig a hole approximately 8 inches in diameter, about 8 inches in depth, okay? And you'll see that in this particular picture here, you'll see that we have a blue container, and we will actually remove that soil and we've put it in that blue container. I know many of you are going to probably ask, well, what is that round ring? Well, this is nothing more, and we'll get that a little bit later. It's called a watering ring. And as you know, in a lot of areas, when you start to water, that water just goes everywhere. You put a hose on it and it just goes in every direction except down. And one of the things you want to try to do with tomatoes is water deeply. And that, you know, they're water hogs, and you really got to water them well. If you just that stuff running all over the top, you'll find that maybe it's very dry, just an inch down. So what we've done here, you'll see, we've taken this old, what I call landscape vinyl edging, and we've stapled them together. And we basically, you know, it doesn't hold water, you know, like a bucket, but it does basically keep it from flowing everywhere and concentrates it in that area. But anyway, so going back, so what we've done, as you see here, we've dug a hole 8 inches in diameter by 8 inches in depth. We're going to place the soil in the container, and we can put that watering ring in. And this is where we say we basically, because the tomato is 95% water, and you know, we have to water maybe every other day more than likely. You know, we want to save water, we want it to go where it goes. You can see on this particular where we've stapled them together, you can bolt them, you can do all sorts of things to fasten them. But the rings, Basically, this one is 4 inches tall, and it's 16 to 8 inches long strip of high density black polylawn edging that's stapled together, okay? And it's going to really affect food production. So once that's all done, you see we've dug the hole, we've got them in a container. So what we're going to do now is we're going to plant, we're going to put the plant in the hole and ensure that the top of the root ball is about 1 to 2 inches level below the level of the topsoil. And you can see that what we're doing here is that we're actually, the soil level inside the little container is about 1 inch to 2 inches below the top level of the actual garden soil. And we'll talk about how we're going to do this. And you can see we've still got the container on it. So what we're going to do then, and you'll see in one of your handouts, one of the things Sam put together for many years ago that works really well, we call it Sam's Special Blend of Fertilizer and Starter Mix. That basically we're going to add to that, that blue container you saw, we're going to add 3 ounces of that into that removed soil that's in that container. And you can see the handout for what it consists of. And I'll just, as a side note, where this particular spring sale, we'll be offering this in pre-mixed containers, so you don't have to go out and get all the chemicals to do that, because it does produce a lot based on what he's got, and you usually got to have 2 or 3 people in it to kind of make it worthwhile to do all this. But man, this stuff works, I can tell you. Anyway, I'm not sure what, I don't think we've set the prices for this yet, but we have mixed everything up, and we will sell them in actually you can do four plants or 8 plants in the 2 sizes that we're going to have offered at the sale, which will be a virtual sale on February 19th. Okay, so, if you really want to go out and mix it yourself, we tend to go someplace like, the feed stores. Another one that in town, the Southwest Fertilizer, always has this stuff. So if you're looking for it, you buy it online, it can be expensive. The prices are, for some reason, are way higher than buying it sometimes from the feed store. I think Lead City Feed Store, all of these feed stores around here tend to have a lot of this stuff. If not, they'll get it for you. But you can kind of see what we've done here. And yes, you can see what we've done. We're not planting the tomato in the container. Many times you guys ask me about this, but you can see what we've done. We've backfilled the container, which has Sam's mix in it, with the fertilizer included. You can see we're putting the soil back into the hole. Now we're going to pull it out, and you see what happened. We've got a nice, even with a 4-inch container, you can do the same thing. You can see we have a nice area to plant. And one of the things that I want to bring up as well is that you see I said that it need to be somewhere between 1 to 2 inches lower than the surrounding soil. And what we find is that it'll tend to produce more root structure. So we'll get into that, but I just want to show you why we're doing this. We put the container in it. It just makes a perfect fit to put it back in, and disturbs the plant the least. So then we go back in with it, okay? And we drop it in. Then we're going to water it in with, we like to use Miracle Grow Quick Start solution. And what we do with this, with our spray pump, is that we take the nozzle off, okay? It makes a good watering thing. You don't have to have that spray. It just makes a nice gentle flow, which you can water very, very easily. The reason for the starter solution minimizes transplant shock, and also rapid intake of nutrients, assist the plant in a quick recovery. I mean, we got a clock running. It can't just sit there and figure, oh, I'm sorry, I got planted today. You got to get it going. It's got to take off. So this is our method by which all right, buddy, it's time to grow. Okay, then you continue backfilling with the remaining soil from that blue container that we had mixed in. And I want you to notice that we've covered a portion of the stem above the root ball. Tomato plants are among the few plants that will develop additional roots when the stem is covered with the soil. So the effect of that is that the larger the root system, the more production. Now, guys, I want to tell you, don't think you can go down 4 or 5 inches, because what happens is that if you pull it, and I can tell you this from experience, only that first 1 inch will put on the additional root structure. You'll have this big gap to where the next roots kind of take on. So that's why I'm telling you, just bring it down about an inch to no more than 2 inches below that level. But it does really assist in actually producing more root structure. Okay, then you can water in well. And if you notice, none of the leaves, the branches are touching the soil. Okay, the planting is complete. We want you to spray with a fungicide, because one of the problems that we face with early planting like this is that when you're watering or a rain occurs, the soil has the most of the pathogens in it. So you want to basically spray it with a fungicide on a weekly basis or after a rain, because it's so close to the ground, you're going to have to try to protect it as best you can, at least here in Galveston County. And I'm very, very strong that never let at any time the leaves of your plant touch the ground. Because as soon as it touches the ground, you start introducing pathogens, and you'll start seeing the yellow leaf effect of early blight, and it'll travel up your plant and kill it. And I'm sure if you've grown tomatoes, you may be aware of that. The other thing that can occur is that, you know, if you live especially near some fields, and you don't have to because they just sort of exist here, but we have cutworms that can mow your plant down as soon as you put these nice little cuttings. With cutworms, the eggs hatch in early March throughout early June, and the larvae spend 3 to 5 weeks chowing down on garden plants in preparation for the pupa stage. They burrow into the soil to pupate, emerging as moths in late August to early September, after which they lay eggs on plant stems and soil. The eggs overwinter, and the process starts all over again. So if your garden is near, especially near large open fields, expect to fight cutworms. So what are we going to do about them? This is your cutworm, and you can kind of see what they do. The effect they simply did, basically your transplant's going to die. They just chop it down. You know, you'll have to replant. That's all I can tell you, you know. But to protect it, you can cover the stem. I'm using here with some kind of cardboard. You can see it's a toilet roll, hand towel roll. You can use toothpicks. You can use sticks. You want to kind of circle that stem, you know, at least 3 or 4 inches above it, above the soil. For this one, you can push the collar into the soil. About a half of the collar is below the soil level, and you tie it with the string, and away you go. It kind of basically, well, you know, you just need to get it so that it gets high enough above the soil that they won't chop it down. Okay, we're going to also talk about things that we do here and we've experimented with, and that is you can also plant your transplants horizontally. And what created this is when we start having the leggy type tomatoes, you know, they're kind of tall and kind of want to flop over, and you know, these are kind of hard to keep going. But we found that, you remember when we said you could basically drop that thing an inch and that it will produce on more roots from the previous slides. Well, what we're going to do here is that we're going to plant them horizontally. And you can see the potential for this is to have a lot bigger, the potential for a larger root system. And again, what it equates to, the larger root system is more production. And in our tests, we generally find earlier fruit set from plants planted horizontally. So, you know, it gets like an early start, what happens. So what we tend to do is that we remove the lower leaves, probably a little more than we would normally do for the other ones. And then we lay them on their side in the sun for about 2 to 3 hours before we transplant. And you'll find the top of the plant's going to just naturally go to the sun. So it makes a curve toward the sun, and you can see what's happening there. This was done right outside a window. And then you dig a hole about 12 inches in diameter. It's a little bit wider, and you only go, instead of 8, you go 6 inches in depth with a stake or whatever you're going to use to hold the transplant stem. Then you're going to place the soil removed in the container like you did before on the other slide. You're going to add the 3 ounces of SAM Special blend to the soil. And then you're going to place the root ball, and I call it much higher in the 4-inch root zone area. You can kind of see what we've got there. Then we're going to backfill with about half of that till you see about half of the plant covered, which, that's the soil that has the SAM Special mix in it. And then you're going to remove the cup, and then you're going to drop the root ball down into the formed hole. Then you're going to water in the root ball with starter solution, a Miracle Grow Quick Start. Then you're going to backfill more. You're going to install your cutworm collar, and you continue backfilling the soil mixed with container. And then you water in the transplant well, and here you go again. It's completed. Now this one's pretty low, so you're going to have to really spray with fungicides such as Doconil or Serenade. Okay, so how many of you guys water too much? Okay, well, let's talk about this, about properly watering your tomatoes. Okay, the key to keeping your tomatoes plants healthy and hydrated is to maintain an even and constant soil moisture level. And I recommend basically, if you're going to water, kind of try to do it at, early morning. And and that's try to do it not say at the same time, but in approximately that area, trying to, instead of going all over the place with watering times. Now, when you're going to water the containers, it's going to differ from tomatoes in the soil. You're going to have to be putting a little bit more water on it, depending on the temperatures that's going on in that area. So we'll talk about that a little more detail. But anyway, this means your plant should never dry out or live in sopping, wet, swampy conditions. You want evenly moist soil is your goal. And you can actually stick your finger in that about an inch down and check it on a regular basis. The daily amount of water it takes to keep the soil around your tomatoes evenly moist depends on so many factors, and its temperature, soil mixture that you're using, and actually even where you plant the thing. So if you keep your soil at the right moisture level, you'll be providing the correct amount of hydration. And that's always one of the things that you're going to really have to maintain for tomatoes, especially they're water hogs. So you're going to have to make sure that they don't dry out, because it tends to affect the production. And uneven watering, in other words, if you go away for a holiday for 2 weeks, and then you figure before you leave, you're going to give it a whole heck of a bunch of water, and then they've dried out during that period for when you return, you come back, put a bunch of water in it. It tends to cause an issue called blossom end rot, where, on the bottom of the tomato, you start seeing it turn black. And that's a result of uneven watering. And it's more or less man-made more than any type of disease that occurs. Some of the things to also consider: weather conditions, plant size, mulching, growth rate, and the soil the tomato is planted in affect the amount of water you're going to plant, the tomato plant needs. Your plants require more water during hot, dry spells and periods of active growth than they do during wet weather or when the plants are young. So, I mean, kind of a common sense thing, but, I just want to make sure that we address it. How well the soil drains and its water holding capacity also affects the amount of water that you're going to need. And healthy tomato plants that wilt excessively or soil that feels dry to the touch indicate that always that more water is needed. Observe your plants daily. They're going to talk to you. When they're drooping, they need water. If you start seeing the edges of the leaves turning brown, that usually can be too much water. Because tomatoes grown in the soil can send their roots deep into the soil when the surface soil dries, they often require less frequent watering than tomatoes grown in containers. However, deep watering to moisten the soil to the root level once or twice a week is preferred to daily light watering. So in other words, that's why we came up with the watering ring. We want to water them, you know, well and deep, but not every day. In other words, we want those roots to go down and get as much moisture as they can. And the root structure of most tomatoes probably won't go more than 12 to 14 inches at the most. So, and most of it being in that 8-inch area of soil. Wetting the surface of the soil without saturating the soil at the root level encourage tomato plants is going to form all on the top of the soil, which compromises the root system of the plant. So as a rule, tomato plants require 1 to 2 inches of water a week. Okay, let's talk about watering in containers, tomatoes in containers. So full-grown tomatoes grown in containers often require daily watering. I mean, that's just the type of thing that occurs when you're growing in containers. The exact amount needed could range from a quart to a gallon, depending on the rate of growth, weather conditions, and also the pot size. As a rule, when you're watering your tomatoes until water runs freely through the bottom of the pot, and again, when the soil feels dry to the touch, 1 inch below the surface provides them with the water they need to thrive. And depending on the size of your planter, a 1 to 2 inch diameter perforated plastic pipe can also be added inside the container before, when you're putting the soil in to aid in watering. It just basically helps it water deeply. 10-gallon white bucket or pots with good drainage. You can see with this one, there's holes in the bottom. I don't know if you can with on your computer, but these have holes in the bottom, work well. Larger pots, 15 to 20 gallons or better. 5-gallon buckets, unless it's a very small variety, generally don't work very well. And that has to do with the fact that it's nice and deep, but it's not very wide. So, some people can be somewhat successful, but you're going to find that generally the plant won't grow as big, and consequently you won't have as many tomatoes, or the size will be affected. So you got to have the right container for this type of plant that you're growing. Container growing does have an advantage, particularly those that have trouble finding 8 hours of sunlight. You can actually move that into an area that will do well. So it allows you to get complete control over the growing medium and also the location. The key to successfully growing tomatoes in a container is to give your tomato plants a consistent amount of water and nutrients, which can be the biggest challenge for growing tomatoes in pots and plants. The goal is to keep the soil moist, not wet. Too much water and your plants' roots will rot. Too little water and the soil will dry out, and plants will get weak and will be susceptible to diseases. And full-grown tomatoes grown in containers, be prepared. They're probably going to require daily watering, and in hot days in some areas, sometimes twice a day. The exact amount needed is going to range from, like I said, from a quart to a gallon, depending on what size of pot you have, and depending on the growth rate, weather conditions, and the pot size. An ideal mix for growing tomatoes in containers consists of a store-bought synthetic like Sunshine Mix, or equal parts perlite, coarse sand, sphagnum peat moss, and compost. Scott's potting soil will also work. But what you're looking for something is a pH that needs to be around 6.5, and be aware that any of this stuff is going to have to be refreshed every year in your pots. Remember as well that tomatoes in containers will need plenty of sun, at least 6 to 8 hours. And I tend to use a slow release fertilizer like Nutristar or Microlife. And I tend to now have been using more of the Osmocote 13-13-13 every 2 weeks at the recommended rate. And that means every time you water, you actually are putting in a nutrient. And I think this really has helped a lot of the container growers. So it's a slow release type of fertilizers that we're using. Clay pots and other porous containers allow additional evaporation from the sides. And you're going to have to, they're nice and they look pretty, but you're going to probably have to require watering more often. And if your pot's too small, it tends to dry out more quickly than the larger ones. You can mulch, you can add windbreaks and can reduce water requirements. In other words, mulch will hold the moisture in, particularly when it starts getting hotter. And you can put a windbreak if the wind starts drying it out too much. You can try using some of that around your containers. But you need to keep good air circulation for the best pollination. Remember, with tomatoes, they're not more or less bee pollinated, except those that are open pollinated, the heirlooms. Most of all tomatoes are wind pollinated. So the wind action from the, say, a bee coming to it is actually from the wings flapping. What you need to do is actually, shake your plant more than actually saying that, well, I don't have enough bee activity. But in saying that, we do have open pollinated tomatoes, that most of them being heirlooms, that do require some type of pollination from a bee or insect or something. Again, as a rule, watering your tomatoes until it runs freely through the bottom of the pot. And again, when the soil feels dry to the touch, 1 inch below, provides them with the water they need. I tend to leach pots once a month with rainwater if I can collect it. I find this has a really good effect. Not everybody can do this, but I'm just telling you that I've tried it and it does make a good effect on it. And in type of tomatoes, Determinants, cherry tomatoes, patio, or sometimes they're actually classified as container tomatoes. Varieties work the best in containers. But no matter what I've tried, these tend to work among the best. One of the things to be aware of, you can see on the picture on your left, they're up against a garage. Keep away from reflective light. They can actually burn these plants. And a good container is some of these that you can buy online that they're self-watering. But you can see what happened here is that they're all piled together. There's no airflow, and this will basically put diseases from one to the other. So I mean, be aware of this, that when you put these things in, it's like the one on the left has some fantastic containers. The one on the right are good, but you've put them in areas that, although you got plenty of sunlight, the reflective heat will scorch them, and the other one is they're just too close together. You've piled them all in a big lump area, and you're going to have trouble. I don't even know how you're going to pick some of these, but anyway. And going back to to where we're talking about putting the transplant. Remember, we went ahead and we staked them. We planted them vertically. We planted them horizontally. We have a watering ring. Well, one of the things that exactly what's happening this week, if you're going to plant like in early February, we say the final step is installing your cage or whatever. If you put pegs, whatever. We're going to protect the little plant, particularly if you're near from breezes and against freezes. You remember that many areas are planting in January and February, and it's Texas, so as you know what's happening next week, they may need protection for a while. So let's talk about that. You can stake your cages to keep them from falling over. You stake them to prevent them more for when they are fully grown. But the fact you've got this protective is wind loading. So if the north winds come in, they can knock it over as well. So anyway, so we end up, you see the pegs on each corner, we put them in there. And you can about imagine that when these plants are full grown, they'll be out of that cage. And when the winds come up, a good breezy wind can knock it over, the wind loading. So we always recommend that you stake them, and you stake them now when you plant your starts, okay? And this one, we do is we've done and been very successful. We install clear plastic covers over the cages. We tend to, because it can be cold, we can create a mini greenhouse. This is actually a clear 55-gallon drum liner, which we've got in one of the big box, and it can work very good. And it's held up, as you can see, with clothespins, or you can use twisted wire, something like that. Clothespins can be picked up still. You can still find these things at the dollar store, so be aware of that. Now this you can't find very much of, This is Sam's, one of his things about tying up, your things. Well, it's a uh, pantyhose that was, you know, you used to be able to get pretty easily. Well, good luck with that. So now you're going to have to use strings and stuff like that, you know. But anyway, you just make sure that the stakes are well in the ground and they're tied off properly. But anyway, um, protecting your plants, you know, I guess from frost, you can see one of the advantages. A wrap, it provides 2 to 4 degrees of frost protection. It protects from the wind, keeps out insects. It allows 85 to 90% of the light penetration. And just by doing this, it gives the plants a good start and increases production by up to 30%. And you can also see we're using hay and manure, the use of it, and you got to be aware of some things. It provides good weed protection and keeps the soil moist. But you do not want to use hay or manure for at least 8 months after harvesting. And that's a lot of times because the hay and stuff that it may have been sprayed by 2,4-D, and it takes at least 8 months to get out of that particular hay or manure. Also be aware on the East Coast, they use a broadleaf herbicide called aminopyralid that it hasn't been used because this particular broadleaf herbicide can last up to 2 years in hay and manure. And we're finding out that it can kill your plant. So again, if you know where your hay comes from and you know what was used on it, then it's a good deal. You can kind of see what happens to it. Basically, you know, you can see what it looks like. It's a good idea to keep a flap of plastic on the top that can be closed completely. Or we got this freeze coming, and what can you do? I mean, if you're down in a certain area and you want to get an early start on planting tomatoes in the ground, you're going to have something like this, because on the really cold nights or doing a rainstorm, you know, it can beat it to death. So, you know, this plastic with a flap will work. But remember, once that passes, you need to open that up. So, you know, and so it can breathe. And generally, we remove all of the coverings on our cages when the temperatures remain above pretty steady 60 degrees. So it gives you an idea, you know, so you probably got about a month of 3 weeks to a month of keeping those covers on it. Another thing that we've used for a quick, you know, all of a sudden, like what's happened, I just put mine out and then 2 days later, having a chance to cover them, you can use something like a 5-gallon bucket and just put that on top of it, provided that the the bucket can fit over the transplant. Yeah, you can see it's basically just you tie a string to the bottom of the bucket, put a stick on it, and you can just drop it down if it has frost coming. So just a quick way. There's another couple of things you can use. You can see how this works. Excuse me. Just giving you some ideas that you can use. It's quick if you have a few plants. If you got a whole field out there, good luck. You can cut the bottoms off of, you know, the milk or water jugs, but be sure that during the day you don't leave those tops on to prevent it overheating. This is something I've tried and it works very well. It's called a wall of water. It's a plastic circular cone that's in circles at about 18 inches diameter, and you fill it with water. And you can kind of see, this really works. You can see what's happened there. You see the snow, and you can see how it's melted the snow around it. And the idea is that the water absorbs the heat of the sun during the day and then releases it at night. And you basically set up the wall of water at least a week before the transplanting to help warm up and even the soil temperature. And it can protect the transplants down to about 18 degrees F. And it works. Just make sure you take it off and don't leave that thing there, because you'll never get it off because it is a circle. Let's talk about fruit set and pollination. Fruit set is affected by nighttime temperatures. It's a nightshade plant. Most tomatoes are, in fact, tomatoes are part of the nightshade plant. Nighttime temperatures below 50 degrees delay the time for pollination, so it won't drop, and it can also cause, if it's for extended period can cause flower drop. And nighttime temperatures above the mid-70s disrupts pollination shed, which also can cause flower drop on large fruited tomatoes. And some of the new varieties, of course, you'll see like it says, it always has this some kind of word like heat in it, will tend to, they've been bred to try to probably go into, instead of mid-70s, like 80 degrees. But so far, we really haven't been totally successful with that. So before we recommend it, we haven't found one yet that really has done well, what we call the extended heat varieties. A lot of them are being experimented with in University of Florida and also at the University of Hawaii, which we've tried some. They've given us some to try here. As I said, tomatoes are wind pollinated. Insect pollinate through their wind action is what helps pollinate. And I always said, you know, to help better pollinate your plants, give your plants a good shake. Okay, there was a question that came up about suckers. The suckers grow in between the established branches. And what we're trying to do when we move the suckers is basically increase the production of larger tomatoes, not the number of tomatoes. This will happen if you leave the suckers on. You will have more tomatoes, but they'll be much smaller. Okay, and they're pruned because they compete with the plant for vital nutrients and water and space and light. So when you take the suckers, you open it up, and it also basically means that the plant can put all the nutrients into what's actually there. You know, you have a choice. You can have a nice small cherry tomato, or maybe something that's much bigger. So if you allow it to mature into a branch, it can result in produce, like I said, an overall smaller overall crop. And when I say smaller overall crop, it can also, because it blocks out a lot of the sun, can reduce the production as well as the size of the tomatoes. And you see where that pencil is pointing? That's where, that's what we call the sucker. You have the main stem, you have a branch, and in between that you'll see that sucker coming up. I tend to start removing the suckers when they get to be about 1.5 feet tall. Sometimes you need some of that basic branch structure to kind of get things going. But once it gets above 1.5 feet, 2 foot tall, you need to start on the indeterminates only. You need to start working on that. And you can see you need a sterile knife or some kind of pruning shear. And make sure that, you use alcohol to clean your shears before you start. And as I said also earlier, if you're growing determinate, pruning is counterproductive because they only grow to a certain height anyway and on the stem. So that's kind of what you should be looking at. Just hope these pictures are give you an idea of what you're looking for to do. I usually tend to mulch later on in the season when it gets really hot, and you kind of keep these things hydrated as is basically tough, and it generally works out that I tend to mulch somewhere between 5 and 6 weeks after the transplanting date. This encourages, of course, healthy plants and fruit development to conserve soil moisture. It keeps the plant roots shielded from radical temperature changes and fluctuations, and it tends to also block out weed growth that could compete with the plants for soil nutrition. And you can just put it around. You can see that's kind of you can see where the root structure tends to is. You see the drip lines? That's kind of where your root structure is going to be kind of ending up. One other thing that we highly recommend doing, and when your plants are growing, is that every week you apply a foliar spray of a water-soluble fertilizer with micronutrients. You can mix 3 tablespoons, 24 ounces of water is the general rule. So, and that can be, when we talk about foliar feeding, you can use, we don't recommend a lot of products, but one that's readily available is like this Miracle Grow all-purpose plant food, and there's others out there. So we also recommend that you side dress through the growing season, and we recommend working in 2 to 3 tablespoons of a balanced nitrogen fertilizer like 15-5-10, 19-5-9, something like that. and make sure it doesn't have uh, some type of weed, uh, block in there, because you do not want to put that on there. You can use a lawn fertilizer, but it doesn't. It has this like weed be gone or anything like that in there. You do not want that. You just want a standard 15-5-10 balanced fertilizer. And you're going to apply it in the circle at the drip line. In part of your handout, you'll kind of see which we give our interns that plant. And in essence, every time you're going to start this one, the first cluster of fruit sets, and I tend to actually do it when I say fruit sets, you're going to start seeing your flowers appear. And because the fruits will set very soon after that. So when you start seeing your first flowers is when you want to start doing the side dressing. And then you're going to do it every 2 weeks. And generally by the time you get to mid-June, when the temperatures are kind of up there, you can discontinue that. So you're going to be applying, looking for the drip line. So when they're small, they're going to be kind of close and will only take that 2 to 3 tablespoons. But every time that you go to every 2 weeks, you'll see that the plant gets bigger. You're looking for that drip line, and you're going to have that circle bigger. So you're going to have to add more. And I usually take a handful and just kind of just drip it in that, and then work it in that outer circle. So you kind of want the roots that are at the pretty well looking for that nutrient to start looking for them to pick up some good nutrients there and keep growing bigger and bigger and reaching out. So I'm trying to get that root structure as big as I can to supply this plant to provide the most production and nutrients for it. So if you keep it continually in the middle, it won't go anywhere. Why has it? It's going to be all lumped in the middle. So you need to get those roots to go out and reach and get that those nutrients and anything else that's in there. So in the soil. Okay, when to pick a good tomato? Well, over and over I hear, well, when a vine ripe, it better be red, and that's the only time to pick it. Well, I disagree with that, and so does A&M. So you can see there's kind of like 6 stages of tomato ripening. Stage 1 is we call it the green stage. The tomato is light dark green. Then we call it the breaker stage. Less than 10% of tomato is changing color. Then there's stage 3, which is we call turning. It's more than 10%, but less than 30% starting to change color. Then we have a pink stage, which is stage 4, more than 30%, but less than 60%. Light red, stage 5, more than 60%, but less than 90%. And it can be pinkish in color. And then, of course, the red stage, which is stage 6, and it's more than 90% of the tomatoes red. So when the heck am I going to pick this thing? Well, let's talk about it. When you talk about ripening, tomatoes begin to ripen and then start turning red when they start producing ethylene gas. So basically, you can place in a warm, semi-humid place of direct sunlight. Only the plants need sunlight, not the tomato. And tomatoes ripen better in the dark. So expect as much as 1 to 2 weeks to fully ripen a tomato after picking under normal temperatures of 72 degrees. If the area they're placed in is too cold, the tomatoes may not fully ripen, or the result will be far less flavorful. Maximum overall yield is greater if you pick the fruit before full ripening. Otherwise, the fruit production slows down. Once there is any show of color, we saw stage 2 or 3 in the fruit, the sugar content is at its peak, so the flavor will be the same ripening on the counter as it would on the vine. So if you pick them too early, especially before if you find one on the ground and it's a real small, I'll pick and make it turn. If the gel hasn't developed inside, it will never turn red. The other plus is that the faster you pick them off the vine, the less chance of bird, insects, and rodents getting them. So what A&M is saying is that when you get that stage 2 or 3, you've already reached almost the maximum sugar content. So you don't really have to leave them all the way out until they're fully red. And a lot of people feel that that's changed, but if you pull them at that point and put them, you'll have let them turn red in a dark spot, they'll be just as good as those picking with fully red. And I guarantee you can try it. So giving you an idea of when to pick it, you see picking this one is just starting. You can see a stage 3 and a stage 2. You can pick at that point, and you will be surprised if you pick them and then let them turn. You can always remove the vines and twigs. When you pull them, be careful when you pull them that you don't leave any of the stem on it. If you put them in a bag, you'll probably punch holes in them. So make sure that that is knocked off of it. So if the tomatoes are dirty, you wash them and allow them to air dry. And when you got them in this area to where you want them to turn, sometimes they're in a box. My grandmother used to leave them under the bed, which sometimes was not a nice smell coming from them. But anyway, that's what she did that for years and years. She would pick them and then put them on there. So keep an eye out for decay or mold. And if you see any, remove the affected tomatoes. Okay, now let's talk about green tomatoes. Now, okay, you planted a fall tomatoes. Frost or freeze is coming, and you got your plant is loaded with these beautiful green tomatoes. What can you do? Well, there are a number of options. And I'm going to kind of, you can use these methods. You can use the vine method to ripen them. You can use a plastic or paper bag method. You can use a cardboard box method. You can use a jar method, or you can get a great recipe for cooking, baking, and pickling green tomatoes. So there's a lot of things you can do, and you can't just leave them out there. The vine method, and I've done this, it works very well. You kind of feel, okay, we're done. Let's lift the entire plant out of the ground, shake the dirt off the roots, hang it upright to dry in a sheltered, warm location like your garage or garden that doesn't freeze or shed, and keep it out of extreme sunlight. And tomatoes will still ripen almost as well on a live vine that was outside. The other thing you can do is you can place 3 or 4 green tomatoes with 1 banana in the bag. The banana should be green on the tips, and you can punch a few holes in the bag to give it some circulation. You can store in a semi-humid area away from direct sunlight, and keep an eye out for it. But if you see any, just please remove them. You don't want to do that. But the banana is well known for giving off ethylene gas, and that's why we use that. A lot of the fruits do that as it's ripening. Cardboard box method. Again, you can line the bottom of the cardboard box with layers of newspaper. You can place the layer of tomatoes in the box next to each other. You can wrap each one separately if you really are, that way inclined. Place a second layer of newspaper on top and close the cardboard box lid. And you just place it in a cool, slightly humid room away from light. You can add banana, but tomatoes are likely to ripen anyway as they release their own ethylene, and they will influence the others. Jar ripening, you can do that jar, big jar, cookie jar, you might have it that's empty. You can put a banana in it and a number of tomatoes and put that together. Put them in there so they don't bruise one another, and you leave some airspace between them. Don't overfill it. Don't just pile up the jar with lots of tomatoes, leave some space there. Then close the lid and, place the jar out in direct sunlight. And then you can check the jar for any moisture build up that could be cause tomato rot, and open the lid if it's too moist. This is something I've done. I've convinced my wife that she wasn't using her cake dish. So I did this. I basically, on day 1, I put 5 tomatoes because I feel that's what we can kind of use. I put a banana in it. By day 3, you can see what's happening, the tomatoes, and by day 4, you can kind of see really getting going. So within about a week, I had quite a few tomatoes to go ahead and use. So, I mean, it's a good little thing. It's good use for a cake dispenser that maybe you're not using as well. So anyway, the other thing is that, for once you've done, say your fall, we want you to make sure that you clean up for the next crop. But here in Galveston County, and particularly here in the South, we're fortunate to have a long growing season in Galveston County in the area. But the summer temperatures can bring a halt to, as we've discussed, to the tomato harvest. So trying to keep the spring planted tomatoes or the fall through the summer is not going to be very productive. So you can plan on having fall tomatoes. You just replant, and the fall tomatoes, you want them to sit idle so you can plant your spring tomatoes. But it does mean you're going to have to remove the old plants and then raking up the old leaves, because some of these old leaves may have been maybe infected with, say, a blight. So you want to kind of get these leaves out of there. Don't till them up in there, because if you think that that's what's happening, you want to plant, make sure you remove all that out and get rid of the old plants. So put them in, if it's, don't put that in a compost if you've had some diseased tomato plants as well. Fall tomatoes are not always successful when trying to beat the first, but we're mainly planting fall tomatoes. Well, we want you to plant with very early varieties like Early Girl, Bush Early Girl, or Parks Whopper. These are all in the 60-day max kind of range, because here in Galveston County, you plant sometimes in August for these fall tomatoes. We also want you to look at rotating crops. Everyone would like to have enough room to rotate the crops, so you won't have to plant tomatoes, and so you don't have to plant tomatoes and their close relatives in the same spot each year. And when we say close relatives, that's peppers, eggplants, potatoes, tomatillos. So I mean, when you're looking at crop rotation, don't include those. We just have to do what you can do, and you plant the area, and you can sweet corn every few years, let it lie fallow, or plant the area with a legume. I do that usually half and half. I'll do half tomatoes and half southern peas or bush beans. Also, we suggest performing solarization on your beds in July and August. We use a clear plastic. Don't use black. It doesn't get hot enough. So we need the UV as well on the soil. And we tend to find that the best use is to use clear plastic, but use 2 layers of clear plastic. Sometimes planting disease-resistant varieties can also help if you're planting in the same area, your tomatoes year after year. And always add more compost and fertilize each year. This kind of helps reduce some of the bad issues you have in the soil. And that's about the best you can do. Talk about a few diseases. Early blight is a very common one, and again, sometimes caused from the leaves, branches being too close to the soil when you're watering, or sometimes the rains will splash that on that. You can kind of see that it's a fungus. It's indicated by black spots and yellowing leaves. You can see what it looks like on your plant. In my next program, I will go into detail on all of these, but if you don't make the tomato 3, this will give you some of the ones that we see more frequently here. You can kind of see how it starts turning yellow from the bottom, and it will reduce plant production and eventually kill the plant. Right here, you can to kind of control it, you trim the lower leaves so that the splashing and watering doesn't get to the leaf as the plant grows. But when it's smaller, you can't really do that. So again, when you're watering, do it early morning and at ground level, and not the entire plant. And again, never let your branches or leaves touch the soil. These are what we tend to recommend. You can spray with a fungicide like Diconol or Serenade a day after the foliar spray is applied. And most fungi is easily washed off with water. So we also recommend you're going to have to spray after the heavy rains, because most of them we're recommending are organic or can be used very easily with anything that you have out there. So anyway, another thing you can do for protecting against birds, this is come Easter time coming up. You can get these eggs, stick a peg in them, and you can kind of do that. But the other one you can see, it's basically with some old misused or unused, many used of tennis balls, and we spray them red, put a screw in, hang it with a clothes hanger wire of some sort, and that helps to some degree. But they need to be installed, these bird deterrents, no later than 2 to 3 weeks prior to establishing the first ripe fruits. And once the birds find your tomatoes, they come back every day, and you may have to resort to some kind of bird netting for protection if you may have to do that. Protecting against rabbits and other rodents, you can kind of see you can build these 1x4 frames and put some wire around it. And we just put stakes, and you can tie them easy. You can get easy access to your plants in there, particularly when they're smaller. When they're getting bigger, you'll have to come up with a different way of supporting them. One of the things we've also done as well is that we're experimenting with putting complete netting over the plants as after about the 3rd week, and we find that we can reduce also the stink bug issues, the leaf-footed stink bugs in particular, and we've had better production with that. Squirrels, oh boy, these are tough. These guys are pretty darn smart. The only thing we kind of feel has to work is you try mechanical protection like chicken wire and netting. You can see you can build these fairly easy with staples and some wire and tie them together, and away you go. Just untie them when you need to get to your plants. You can try chemical warfare with a predator in. You can get a cat or a dog. Last resort, you can shoot them, or you can just damn well move. I mean, I don't know what else you can do with these things. So coming to an end, we're wishing you much success, and it's difficult to think anything but pleasant thoughts while eating a homegrown tomato.